Thanks to Daniel for that report. And staying with that, joining us to discuss the implications of today's Supreme Court's case is Jill Homan, Deputy Director of Trade and Economic Policy at the American First Policy Institute. Thank you for joining us this morning, Jill. Is there a legal definition for a, quote, emergency under the 1977 International Emergency Economic Powers Act?
Thank you for having me. And as the president has explained, this is and he called it the most critical Supreme Court case ever. And as you described, the president has declared two emergencies. We have two crises. The first of which is we're running a trade deficit over $1 trillion. It's completely unsustainable. And that means that we are weakening our country. We're borrowing from foreign nations, many of which are adversaries, in order to fund this consumption-driven economy. So that's a trade deficit. The second crisis is the fentanyl that's been flooding across our borders, and it's become the number one killer of young adults ages 18 to 44. So as a result of these two crises, the president has declared an emergency on these crises, and that gives him the authority to be able to implement this tariffs under the provisions of IEEPA. And that's also what's going to be discussed at the Supreme Court case, which at AFPI, we filed amicus brief in support of the president having the authority, and we're confident that the president is going to come out on top once the Supreme Court justices hear the case today.
And can you explain the concept of the tariffs in terms of national security, which the president framed very strongly in his 60 Minutes interview?
Certainly. And so what the president done, and as I had mentioned before, is by being able to implement the tariffs, and he had cited the example of China, what he's doing is stemming the flow of fentanyl and opioids, across the border. And so he's been using it as a tool in his trade negotiations and in his negotiations with these countries. And that's what we've seen actually as of just last night. The president reduced an additional tariff from 20% to 10% because of additional concessions that China has made in recognizing that it needs to play a stronger role to prohibit the elements that make fentanyl and opioids from coming into our country. And so the president was able to negotiate that provision and therefore was able to lower an additional tariff from 20% to 10%.
Yeah, and you used the example of adversary China. But even with friendly nations, the U.S. for a very long time, many decades, has been subject to not only unreciprocal tariffs, but also unreciprocal market access. Can you help describe what the economic impact that this has had on the U.S.'s economy and the livelihood for, working Americans?
Exactly. And so, many people are assuming that we started from a place of reciprocal tariffs, and that's just not the case, as you pointed out. So the United States was providing unfettered access to our markets, but in turn, even our trading partners were implementing and requiring the United States companies to pay tariffs when they access their markets, which when you say that to all Americans and most Americans, they just think, well, that's not fair. And that's what reciprocity really is about. And as a result of these tariffs over the last 12 months, now granted, only a portion of the time President Trump was in office, but these tariffs have generated close to $200 billion. And that's enough, for example, to fund the U.S. Army. And so these tariffs are generating revenue, but really they're not an end in and of itself. They're also a means in order for our president to have the authority to go out and negotiate strong trade deals, which we heard from Caroline Leavitt describe. And so these trade deals have provided and required countries to reduce non-tariff barriers, so meaning to enable American companies to be able to sell more overseas. And they've also included elements of our trading partners having investment commitments to invest and expand companies in the United States, which will create more American jobs. And this is all about moving from a consumption-based economy to a production economy, one that grows jobs in the country. Because what we saw since China's ascension into the WTO and from it receiving the most favored nation status back in 2001, that America has lost hundreds of thousands and by some accounts, some have said up to 5 million jobs. And so that has hollowed out what are blue-collar jobs, and has also really hurt our capacity and our supply chain and our national security. And so by focusing on building up our domestic capabilities, we're able to shore up critical supply chains. And so we've seen that in conversations about rare earth and critical minerals, which it started, and the technology started in the United States. And over time, companies sold, and then ultimately that ended up being a significant power and an industry in China. And so here we are in a very weak position on this critical industry. And we've seen the same thing play out with shipbuilding. And that's why, for example, our trading ally of South Korea, a key component of that deal negotiation included an investment of $150 billion in rebuilding America's shipbuilding capacity. And so the president, think of this, the president is using tariffs as leverage in order to secure market access, which grows American companies and American jobs, and also it does generate revenue, but also to provide investment opportunities, which also, when you have greenfield investments and when you have other countries that are buying more planes, for example, that leads to more American jobs, higher wages, and ultimately protects American workers.
Yeah, you mentioned how the trillions of dollars of investment that has come into the U.S. would not have been possible without the tariffs, because they would just continue producing overseas and then just shipping in. But with the threat of the tariff, it's more viable for them to invest in production in America. So I want you to contrast what you see as some of Trump's greatest wins with the tariffs and how potential inflationary concerns may or may not be mitigated.
Yes. So really 3 points about the wins. First of which is the tariffs have generated revenue. And so to the extent they're generating revenue, we're facing as a country actually it's now $38 trillion debt. That's $110,000 for every man, woman, and child. And so to the extent we're able to generate more revenue, it provides us an ability to, pay down the debt, reduce taxes, and really strengthen our country. And so that's the first point. Secondly is as I mentioned, by implementing the tariffs, it enables the president to have the leverage in order to reduce and require countries to reduce non-tariff barriers. And so we've seen that with companies being able to sell more abroad in certain instances, particularly with our agriculture industry. And then thirdly, when these trade agreements and trade frameworks include an investment commitment, those investment commitments enable more companies to expand and hire American workers. And so just to give you one example is within his Asia trip, if you add up all of the investment commitments, that totals about $2 trillion. And if we expand that and say that investment comes over the next 10 years, that's about $200 billion a year. And there's academic studies that have said for every billion that's about invested, that's about 6,000 jobs. And so what this means is at $200 billion a year, you're talking about over 1 million jobs that this one trip could bring back to this country. And so that's the significance. And I understand the point about inflationary and the critique on that. And what I would point out is let's look at the data from past years, particularly when the president was in office. And we saw in 2018 and 2019 that the movement on prices were just a few tenths of a percent. And I think all of us will appreciate that this was the greatest economy when the president was in office, and wages were high. The stock market was high. And so I think most people would agree that if we can get strong wages and our investments and and our retirement savings can grow if we have just a short-term movement on prices. It's something that we see as a means to an end, and that's really what we're seeing with the price movement. Is it's not significant, and we don't expect it to be very significant, and we expect the benefits of these trade agreements to far outweigh any short-term inflationary movement.
Well, we've been watching the Supreme Court today with great interest. Appreciate your analysis. Jill Homan, thank you for joining.
Thank you for having me.